There's a kind of love that doesn't begin with a glance across a crowded room. It doesn't begin with a letter or a stolen conversation or the slow, predictable orbit of two people circling each other at parties. Sometimes love begins with a door slamming shut, with a command, with someone telling you exactly where you belong and you deciding, quietly, permanently, that they're wrong. This is a story about a woman who was told to stay in her place, and what happened when she refused. If stories like this move you, if you believe that dignity is worth more than a title, and that the people who see us clearly are the ones who change us forever, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Subscribe, stay, and let this one settle into your bones. It's going to stay with you. The rain had turned the road to soup 3 miles back, and the carriage had been groaning ever since. Sable Renfield pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the hedgerows blur into watercolor smears of green and black. Her fingers ached from gripping the edge of the seat. Every rut in the road sent the trunk behind her sliding, thumping against the back wall like a restless heartbeat. She shouldn't be here. The thought had been circling for the better part of 2 hours, persistent and unwelcome, the way a draft finds the gap beneath a door, no matter how many rags you stuff against it. She shouldn't be in this carriage, shouldn't be wearing her dead mother's good wool traveling dress, shouldn't be heading toward a house she'd never seen to work for a man she'd never met. But Sable's aunt had made the arrangements with the certainty of someone disposing of a problem. Her brother's daughter had become inconvenient. 23, unmarried, educated beyond her station, and worst of all, opinionated. When the letter arrived from the Duchy of Ashworth, requesting a cataloger for their private library, Aunt Phoebe had responded before the ink was dry. "You'll earn your keep," she'd said, folding the letter with finality. "And you'll be out of my house before the Michaelmas tenants arrive. I need the room." The room. Sable's room. The one she'd slept in since she was 9 years old, since the fever took her mother and her father simply stopped functioning, retreating into silence and gin until one January morning when he didn't wake up at all. Aunt Phoebe had taken her in with all the warmth of someone accepting a parcel they hadn't ordered. The carriage lurched violently, and Sable's temple cracked against the window frame. She hissed, pressing her palm to the spot, and blinked away stars. Through the rain-smeared glass, she saw it. Ashworth Hall. It rose from the landscape like something that had always been there, older than the trees surrounding it, older than the road that led to it. Stone the color of wet bone, 3 stories of windows reflecting the storm-dark sky, a central tower that looked like it had been arguing with God for centuries. The ground stretched in every direction, formal gardens dissolving into parkland, dissolving into forest, all of it drenched and magnificent and deeply unwelcoming. The carriage stopped at a side entrance, not the main doors with their carved stone lintel and iron lanterns, the servants' entrance. Sable noted this without surprise. She was, after all, the help. A footman in dark livery opened the carriage door without greeting. Rain gusted in, spattering the hem of her dress. She climbed down, her boots sinking into gravel, and looked up at the house looming above her. "Miss Renfield." A woman stood in the doorway, dry and rigid, her black dress buttoned to the throat. "I'm Mrs. Calloway, housekeeper. You're late." The roads were... "Follow me. His Grace doesn't tolerate delays." His Grace. The Duke of Ashworth. Sable had learned precisely 3 things about him from the letter of employment. His name was Deverell Marchand. He required someone to catalog and restore his family's private collection, and he expected the work done in silence. Mrs. Calloway moved through the house at a pace that made conversation impossible. Sable caught impressions only. A vast kitchen radiating heat, a corridor lined with servant bells, a narrow staircase that switched back on itself twice before delivering them onto a landing that smelled of beeswax and something older, something like stone remembering water. "The library is through there, Mrs. Calloway pointed toward a pair of heavy oak doors. You'll work from 7 until 6, with a half-hour for luncheon brought to you. His Grace has given specific instructions. The collection is not to leave the library. You are not to wander the house. Your quarters are in the East Wing. Sable frowned. The East Wing? Staff quarters, Mrs. Calloway said, though something flickered behind her eyes. Meals will be sent to your room. You'll find everything you need. Before Sable could respond, a door at the far end of the corridor opened, and a man walked through. No, not walked. Occupied the space. He moved the way weather moves into a valley, filling it completely, leaving no room for anything else. Tall, angular, dark-haired with a severity that went beyond grooming into something architectural. His face was all planes and edges, a jaw cut sharp enough to leave marks, eyes so dark they swallowed whatever light the corridor offered. He wore black, as if color were a concession he refused to make. He stopped when he saw her. His gaze traveled from her rain-darkened hem to her wind-wrecked hair to the small red mark blooming on her temple where she'd hit the window. "This is the cataloger?" he said to Mrs. Calloway, but his eyes didn't leave Sable. "Miss Renfield, Your Grace, arrived just now." The Duke of Ashworth studied her, the way a man studies a crack in a foundation wall, assessing damage, calculating cost. "You're younger than I expected," he said flatly. "You're ruder than I expected," Sable replied. The words left her mouth before her brain could catch them, like a horse bolting through a gate left unlatched. She heard Mrs. Calloway's sharp intake of breath, felt the corridor temperature drop. The Duke's expression didn't change, not a flicker. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough for Sable to feel the weight of what she'd just done settle across her shoulders like a yoke. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice precise as a surgical instrument. "Show Miss Renfield to the East Wing. She can begin work tomorrow, once she's learned that the people who work in my house do not speak to me as though we are equals." He turned away. "We aren't equals, Your Grace," Sable heard herself say. She couldn't stop. Something in his dismissal, in the casual way he'd reduced her to a crack in a wall, had lit a fuse she couldn't reach. "You have the title. I have the skills you apparently need, badly enough to hire a woman you've never met, based on a single letter of reference. So you're right. We aren't equals at all." The Duke stopped walking. He didn't turn around. "Stay in the East Wing until you learn your place, Miss Renfield." His voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely final. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark mouth of the corridor. Mr. Calloway stared at Sable with an expression caught between horror and something that might, in better light, have resembled admiration. "Well," the housekeeper said, "that's the fastest anyone has ever made His Grace angry. The last cataloger lasted 2 weeks before managing it. You've done it in under a minute." "How many catalogers have there been?" Sable asked. Mrs. Calloway's silence was its own answer. The East Wing was not servants' quarters. Sable realized this the moment Mrs. Calloway opened the door to her assigned rooms. Servants' quarters meant narrow beds, shared walls, a basin and a candle. This was something else entirely. A sitting room with faded wallpaper that had once been elegant. A bedroom beyond it with a 4-poster bed stripped to its bones. A writing desk positioned beneath a window that overlooked a walled garden gone to seed. The furniture was good, but neglected. Dust cloths covered half the surfaces. The fireplace hadn't been lit in what looked like months. This was the family wing, Sable said. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Calloway set down the candle. It was Lady Marchand's wing, the Duke's mother. She preferred these rooms. After she passed, His Grace closed it off. When did she die? 8 years ago. His Grace was 24. Mrs. Calloway moved to the window, pulling the curtains open with a practiced snap. He doesn't come here. No one does. That's rather the point. The implication landed with quiet brutality. He hadn't sent her to the servants' quarters. He'd sent her to the most isolated, most emotionally charged wing of the house, a place so thick with memory and grief that even the servants avoided it. Stay in the East Wing until you learn your place. It was a punishment designed to break her with loneliness before she ever touched a single book. "The last cataloger," Sable said carefully. "The one who lasted 2 weeks. Where was he housed?" "The same rooms. They were all housed here." "All?" Mrs. Calloway turned, her expression guarded. "You're the 4th in 2 years, miss. The collection is vast, and the Duke is particular. The first left after 3 days. The second lasted a week. The third managed a fortnight." She paused. None of them were women. Sable absorbed this. Why does he keep hiring people he clearly doesn't want in his house? The housekeeper moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. She seemed to wrestle with something, loyalty pulling against a different impulse. "The collection belonged to his mother, Mrs. Calloway said finally. "She built it over 20 years. Literature, philosophy, natural history, correspondence with scholars across Europe. After she died, His Grace locked the library and left everything as it was. Then last year, damp got into the east wall, water damage. Some of the volumes are deteriorating. He has no choice but to have them catalogued and preserved, or lose them entirely. So he needs this done, Sable said, but he can't bear to have it done." Mrs. Calloway's expression confirmed everything her words wouldn't. "Breakfast is at 6. The library will be unlocked at 7. I'd suggest, miss, that tomorrow you simply work quietly and avoid drawing His Grace's attention." She left, pulling the door shut with a soft click that echoed in the empty wing like a stone dropped into a well. Sable stood in the center of the sitting room, listening. The East Wing was silent in a way that went beyond quiet. It was the silence of a place that had been deliberately abandoned, rooms holding their breath, waiting for someone who would never return. She unpacked her trunk slowly. 3 dresses, 2 of them mended so many times, the original fabric was more suggestion than substance. Her mother's hairbrush, ivory with 2 teeth missing. A copy of Montaigne's essays with her father's marginalia covering every page. And the letter of employment, signed not by the Duke himself, but by a solicitor named Hargrove, which Sable had found peculiar at the time, but now understood. The Duke hadn't wanted to write the letter, hadn't wanted to acknowledge that he needed help. The solicitor had handled it the way solicitors handle things the client can't bring himself to face. She set the Montaigne on the writing desk and opened it to a passage her father had underlined 3 times, pressing so hard the pen had nearly cut through the page. "The thing I fear most is fear itself." Sable looked out the window at the darkening garden. Somewhere in this vast, cold house, a man who commanded rooms by existing in them was carrying a wound he'd rather let destroy his mother's legacy than allow a stranger close enough to help. She'd been sent to the East Wing to learn her place. What the Duke of Ashworth didn't know yet, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Sable Renfield had spent her entire life being told where she belonged. By her aunt, by circumstance, by a world that measured women's worth in dowries and docility. She'd never once listened. The library stole her breath. 2 stories of books, floor to ceiling, with a mezzanine gallery running the full perimeter. Tall windows poured morning light across reading tables, still arranged as though someone might sit down at any moment. A globe stood in one corner, positioned beside a chair, with a shawl draped over its arm. 8 years old, that shawl, and still waiting. Sable pressed her hands together to keep them from shaking. This was the most beautiful room she'd ever entered, and it was dying. She could see the damage immediately. The east wall wept moisture in dark stains that crept upward from the baseboards. 3 lower shelves had already suffered. Leather bindings warped and blooming with mildew, pages swollen and fused together. The smell hit her next. beneath the familiar perfume of old paper and binding glue, the sour tang of rot. She'd been working for 2 hours, carefully removing damaged volumes and logging their condition in a notebook, when the library door opened. It wasn't the Duke. A young man entered with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up in this house and never questioned his right to any room in it. He was perhaps 24, fair-haired where the Duke was dark, with an open, mobile face that seemed built for smiling. He was smiling now, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "So, you're the new one," he said. "I had a wager with Mrs. Calloway that you wouldn't last the night. She said you had grit. I owe her a shilling." Sable set down the volume she was examining. "And you are?" "Tehran Marchand, brother to the tyrant, resident disappointment, and the only person in this house who'll give you an honest answer about anything." He pushed off the doorframe and wandered toward her, picking up a damaged book and turning it over with casual interest. "You've already met Deverell, I gather. Charming, isn't he? He told me to stay in the East Wing until I learn my place." Theron's eyebrows rose. "He put you in the East Wing? That's new. The others were in the East Wing too, but he's never said the quiet part aloud before." He set the book down and looked at her directly for the first time. Whatever he saw made his expression shift from amusement to something more careful. "What did you say to him?" "I pointed out that he needs my skills more than I need his approval." Theron let out a low whistle. "And you're still alive. Remarkable." He pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, stretching his legs. "Let me tell you what you've walked into, Miss Renfield, since my brother certainly won't. I'm meant to be working in silence. You're meant to be working in misery until you quit. That's the actual arrangement. Deverell needs the collection saved, but he can't stand having anyone near it. This was our mother's world. Every book, every note, every marginalia, it's her. Having a stranger's hands on it is like someone touching a wound he won't let heal." The words landed close to what Mrs. Calloway had implied, but Theron said them without the housekeeper's careful diplomacy. He said them like facts that needed facing. "Then why hire anyone at all?" Sable asked. "Because the alternative is watching her collection rot, and that's the one thing worse than letting someone in." Theron stood, moving to the window. "3 catalogers before you. All men, all experienced, all perfectly competent. The first tried to reorganize the shelving system. Deverell dismissed him on the spot. The second moved the globe to make room for his workspace. Gone by morning. The third lasted longest because he was terrified enough to touch nothing without written permission. But eventually he needed to access the upper gallery, where Mother used to read. Deverell found him sitting in her chair, and the man was out of the house within the hour." Sable looked at the chair with the shawl. "Everything is a relic." "Everything is a grave marker," Theron corrected quietly. "And you're working in the middle of a mausoleum that he's too proud to call one." "Why are you telling me this?" Theron turned from the window. His expression had lost all its earlier lightness. "Because you're the first one who answered him back. The others were afraid of his title. You weren't. That either makes you very stupid or exactly what this house needs." Before Sable could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Measured, deliberate, unmistakable. Theron straightened, his easy manner snapping back into place like a mask. "Ah," he said. "The tyrant approaches." The library door opened, and the Duke of Ashworth entered. His gaze found Theron first, and something cold moved across his features. "I wasn't aware you'd taken an interest in library science, Theron. I was welcoming our new guest. Someone ought to. You certainly didn't manage it last night." The brothers stared at each other across the reading table, and Sable felt the air between them pressurize. This wasn't simple disagreement. This was something older, deeper, a fault line running beneath the surface of their relationship. "Miss Renfield doesn't need welcoming," the Duke said, his eyes shifting to Sable. "She needs to work quietly, without distraction. The emphasis on distraction was aimed squarely at his brother. Theron held his hands up in surrender, but his eyes were still hard. Of course. Far be it from me to interfere with the sacred silence. He moved toward the door, pausing beside Sable. If you need anything, Miss Renfield, my rooms are in the west wing, the inhabited part of the house. He left, and Sable was alone with the Duke. The silence that followed was cavernous. The Duke stood near the globe, his hand resting on its surface, his thumb tracing the curve of a continent he wasn't seeing. My brother talks too much, he said finally. Your brother seems to be the only person willing to talk at all. His jaw tightened. You have your instructions, Miss Renfield. The collection needs cataloging. The damaged volumes need assessment. I expect a written report every Friday detailing your progress. Beyond that, I see no reason for us to interact. He left without waiting for her response, and the library doors closed behind him with the heavy finality of a verdict. Sable stood in the quiet cathedral of his mother's books and understood, with perfect clarity, the cage she'd been placed in. She couldn't leave. She had nowhere to go, no money, no other prospects. Her aunt had given away her room. She couldn't confront the Duke. Every honest word only deepened his walls. And she couldn't simply work in meek silence because the collection was vast, the damage was urgent, and saving it would require decisions the Duke would have to approve, which meant conversations the Duke refused to have. She was trapped between his grief and his pride, locked in a wing of ghosts, working in a room full of a dead woman's fingerprints, answerable to a man who wanted her gone, but needed her desperately. She opened her notebook and began to write. Day 1. The collection comprises approximately 4,000 volumes. Water damage affects the eastern wall, lower 3 shelves, roughly 200 books, at immediate risk. The Duke of Ashworth does not want me here. I intend to stay. By the end of her first week, Sable had cataloged 312 volumes, identified 67 with active mold damage, and written 2 Friday reports that the Duke had acknowledged with nothing more than a single word, scrawled at the bottom of each page. Noted. She'd also discovered something the previous catalogers apparently hadn't survived long enough to find. The upper gallery, accessible by a narrow spiral staircase, tucked behind a tapestry of Persephone descending into the underworld, held a second collection. Not books, letters. Hundreds of them, bundled in ribbon, stored in wooden boxes with dates inked on their lids. Correspondence spanning 2 decades between the late Duchess and scholars, poets, philosophers, naturalists. Some of the names made Sable's hands tremble. These weren't just letters. They were a private intellectual history of one of the most brilliant women of her generation, hidden away in a gallery that smelled of cedar and slow decay. The damp had reached here too. 2 of the boxes nearest the east wall had already darkened with moisture. If the letters weren't moved within weeks, they'd be gone. This was the decision the Duke would have to approve, the decision that required conversation he'd forbidden. Sable wrote her 3rd Friday report. This time, she didn't leave it on the library desk for collection. She carried it through the house, past the main staircase, through the portrait gallery, where generations of Marchands watched her with oil-painted suspicion, and knocked on the door of the Duke's study. Silence. Then, enter. He sat behind a desk the size of a small country, papers arranged with military precision, a glass of something amber catching the afternoon light. He looked up, and his expression hardened the moment he recognized her. Miss Renfield, reports are to be left in the library. This report requires a response beyond noted, Your Grace. She crossed the room and placed the pages on his desk before he could refuse them. He stared at the report as though she'd deposited a live snake, then picked it up with deliberate slowness. She watched his eyes move across the pages, watched them stop, watched the color leave his face. The upper gallery, he said. His voice had lost its edge. What remained was something raw, something unprotected. You went into the upper gallery. The staircase was behind the tapestry. I needed to assess the full scope of the damage. Those letters are private. Those letters are deteriorating. 2 boxes on the east wall have moisture damage already. If they aren't relocated within the month, the correspondence is lost. Permanently. His hand flattened against the desk, pressing down as if holding something in place. You had no right. You hired me to catalog and preserve the collection. The letters are part of the collection. Unless you'd prefer, I let them rot, while I politely pretend they don't exist. The silence between them could have split marble. "What do you want?" he asked finally, and the question sounded like it cost him something. Sable had prepared for this. She'd spent 3 nights in the East Wing rehearsing this conversation, anticipating his resistance, building her case the way her father had taught her to build an argument. Foundation first, then walls, then the part you actually need them to see. 3 things, she said. First, authorization to move the damaged materials to the west side of the gallery, away from the affected wall. I won't take them from the library. They'll stay in the room. But they need to be moved. His jaw worked. And? Second, I need access to the house records to cross-reference the correspondence. Your mother's letters mention volumes that should be in the collection, but aren't on the shelves. Either they've been moved or they're missing. I can't do a proper catalog with gaps I can't account for. You want to search my house. I want to search for your mother's books. There's a difference. Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something closer to recognition, as if she'd said something he'd thought himself, but never spoken aloud. Third? His voice was quieter now. I need you to stop punishing me for being here. The words hung in the air between them. The Duke's expression didn't change, but his hand on the desk curled slowly into a fist. I'm not. The East Wing. The silence. The reports answered with a single word. You need this work done, Your Grace, but you're making it as difficult as possible because my presence in that library feels like a violation. I understand that. I understand what that room means to you. But I can't save your mother's collection if you're working against me. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, and Sable saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, the way his hands clasped behind his back, so tightly the knuckles bleached white. You don't understand what that room means to me, he said. You can't. Then tell me. The silence stretched. Outside, wind moved through the park, bending the trees in long, slow waves. Move the letters, he said finally. West wall only. Nothing leaves the library. I'll have Mrs. Calloway give you access to the household inventory, though not my private study. And he paused, swallowed. I'll endeavor to be less obstructive. It was not an apology. It was not warmth. But it was a door cracked open. Just barely. Just enough for light to enter. Thank you, Your Grace. Don't thank me, Miss Renfield. Just save the collection. She left his study carrying something she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not permission, but the memory of his voice when he'd said you can't. Not dismissive, not cold. Broken. The voice of a man standing in front of a wound and daring someone to look at it. She thought about it all the way back to the East Wing, and she was still thinking about it when she fell asleep that night in the dead Duchess's rooms, surrounded by the faint scent of jasmine that no amount of time had managed to erase. The household inventory was a revelation. Mrs. Calloway delivered it the following morning. 3 leather-bound ledgers spanning 40 years, documenting every acquisition, every gift, and every volume that had entered or left Ashworth Hall. The late Duchess's handwriting appeared on nearly every page, small and precise, with occasional annotations that veered from the catalogical into the personal. Received from Professor Harwick in Vienna. A peculiar man, but a generous one. The binding is exquisite. Sebastian's christening gift from the Linnaean Society. He'll appreciate it someday, when he stops chewing the covers. Sebastian. The Duke's given name was Deverell. Sable frowned, then realized Sebastian must have been the Duchess's private name for him. A mother's name, intimate and soft, nothing like the hard syllables of Deverell that the world used. She spent the next several days cross-referencing the inventory against the shelves, and the library began to reveal itself not as a collection, but as a portrait. The Duchess had been systematic and passionate in equal measure. Natural philosophy sat beside French poetry. Botanical treatises shared shelves with Gothic novels. There was a complete set of Mary Wollstonecraft, heavily annotated, beside a first edition of Linnaeus that must have cost a fortune. This was not a decorative library assembled for show. This was the working mind of a woman who'd been ferociously, unapologetically brilliant. Sable found herself talking to her, not aloud, not in any way she'd have admitted, but internally as she handled each volume. You had beautiful taste. You organized by association rather than alphabet. I see what you were doing. You put the Wollstonecraft beside the Linnaeus because both of them were arguing that observation matters more than received wisdom. Clever. I would have done the same. The house itself began to lose its hostility. Or perhaps Sable was simply learning its rhythms. She discovered that the kitchen garden behind the east wing still grew herbs, tended by an elderly gardener named Fenwick, who spoke mostly to his plants, but occasionally offered Sable a sprig of rosemary with a wordless nod. She learned that the servants' hall came alive after 9 in the evening, Mrs. Calloway presiding over tea and quiet gossip with a warmth she never displayed upstairs. She learned that Alice, the youngest housemaid, left wildflowers outside her door every other morning, for no reason she'd ever explain. Theron visited the library most afternoons, always with an excuse, looking for a particular atlas, checking on the globe, returning a book he'd borrowed years ago. He'd stay for 20 minutes, talking easily while Sable worked, telling her about the estate, the tenants, the village. Deverell runs everything, he said one afternoon, sprawled in a chair while Sable rebound a damaged spine. Every farm, every lease, every repair. Father was hopeless with money, charming, generous, completely incapable of saying no to anyone. Mother managed the finances quietly from this room, actually. Deverell didn't know that until after she died, when he found her account books and realized she'd been holding the estate together for years. He took over at 24, Sable said. Took over everything. Estate, debts, Parliament, Theron's upbringing. He gestured to himself with a wry smile. I was 16 and determined to be useless. He didn't let me. Paid for my education, dragged me to estate meetings, made me learn what every tenant farmer needed and why it mattered. That sounds like a good brother. It sounds like a man who decided that if he controlled everything, nothing else could fall apart. Theron's smile faded. The problem is that control became his entire identity. He doesn't know how to be anything else, doesn't know how to grieve without managing it, doesn't know how to feel without scheduling it first. Sable thought of the Friday reports. Noted. One word, perfectly controlled, revealing nothing. He reads your reports, you know, Theron added, standing to leave. All of them. Cover to cover. He just doesn't want you to know that. That evening, Sable sat at the writing desk in her rooms and looked out at the walled garden. The jasmine scent was stronger tonight, carried on warm air through the open window. She'd been at Ashworth Hall for 12 days, and something had shifted without her noticing. The East Wing no longer felt like exile. The silence had softened from oppressive to contemplative. The Duchess's rooms, with their faded elegance and lingering perfume, had become not a punishment, but a kind of companionship. As if the woman who'd built the library, who'd written those sharp, loving annotations, who'd called her fierce eldest son Sebastian, as if she approved of someone finally being here. Sable opened the Montaigne and found her father's handwriting. We do not learn for school, but for life. She was learning, not just about the collection, but about the house, the family, the carefully maintained architecture of grief that held Ashworth Hall together, and somewhere beneath all of it, she was learning about a man who'd locked away the most important room in his life, and then, when the walls started weeping, had been forced to let a stranger inside. She picked up her pen and began writing her fourth Friday report. This time, she included something she hadn't before: a recommendation. The upper gallery letters represent the most significant portion of the collection. They document not only the late Duchess's intellectual contributions, but her personal philosophy of education and inquiry. I recommend, when the cataloging is complete, that a selection be considered for donation to a university archive, where they might benefit scholars for generations. This is, of course, entirely at your Grace's discretion. She sealed it, left it on the library desk, and went to bed. She did not know that the Duke read it at midnight, alone in the library he claimed never to visit. She did not know that he sat in his mother's chair for the first time in 8 years, holding the report in hands that would not stop shaking. She did not know that he read her recommendation 3 times before folding the paper carefully, pressing it flat, and placing it inside the cover of a book of French poetry his mother had loved. But she would find out. Eventually, she would find out everything. The carriage arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced, bearing a woman who needed no announcement. Sable was in the upper gallery, carefully transferring letters from a water-damaged box to a dry cedar chest she'd requisitioned from Mrs. Calloway, when she heard the front doors open and a voice cut through the house like a blade through silk. "Where is my grandson? And why has no one answered my letters?" She reached the mezzanine railing in time to see Mrs. Calloway curtsying in the entrance hall below, and beyond her, a woman descending from the carriage with the unhurried authority of someone who considered the entire county her personal drawing room. Margot Marchand, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, was small, silver-haired, and terrifying. She wore dove-gray traveling clothes with a single brooch at her throat, a ruby the size of a quail's egg, and she surveyed the entrance hall with an expression that suggested the house had failed to meet her standards simply by existing. "Your Grace," Mrs. Calloway began. "Don't Your Grace me, Calloway. Where is Deverell?" "Estate business, Your Grace. He's riding the north boundary with Mr. Pemberton." "And Theron?" "The village, Your Grace. He visits the school on Tuesdays." The Dowager's eyes narrowed. "So neither of my grandsons is here to greet me. How perfectly characteristic." Her gaze traveled upward, along the staircase, past the portraits, and landed directly on Sable, standing at the mezzanine railing with a bundle of 200-year-old letters in her hands. The Dowager went very still. "And who," she said, "is that?" Sable descended the staircase with as much composure as she could manufacture. Dust marked her sleeves. A pencil was still tucked behind her ear. Her dress was her second best, which meant it was barely adequate for gardening, let alone meeting a Dowager Duchess. "Your Grace." She curtsied, grateful for the muscle memory drilled into her by a mother who'd believed manners were armor. "I'm Sable Renfield. I'm cataloging the library collection." The Dowager's eyes moved over her with surgical precision, the pencil behind her ear, the dust on her cuffs, the careful posture, the worn dress, the bundle of letters she still held, because setting them down on any surface outside the library would violate the Duke's instructions. "You're the cataloger," the Dowager said flatly. "You're a woman." "I've been one my whole life, Your Grace." Something shifted behind the Dowager's eyes. Not warmth, nothing so generous, but a recalculation, the way a chess player reassesses the board when a piece appears where it shouldn't be. "Put those down," the Dowager said, "and come with me." Sable looked at Mrs. Calloway, who gave a barely perceptible nod. "I can't set them down, Your Grace. They need to stay in the library. If you'll allow me one moment, you won't set down letters because my grandson told you not to. Because the preservation protocol requires. I know what the letters are, girl. I watched my daughter-in-law write half of them." The dowager's voice held a sudden edge that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with memory. "Bring them then. We'll talk in the library." They climbed the stairs together, the dowager moving with the deliberate pace of someone whose joints no longer cooperated with her will, but who refused to acknowledge it. Inside the library, her composure cracked. It was brief, a fracture that appeared and sealed itself within the space of a breath. But Sable saw it. The way the dowager's hand reached for the back of the nearest chair, the way her eyes moved to the globe, to the shawl still draped over the reading chair, to the shelves where her daughter-in-law's handwriting still marked the spines. "He hasn't changed anything," the dowager murmured. "No, Your Grace. 8 years, and he hasn't moved so much as a bookmark." Sable placed the letters carefully on the reading table and waited. The dowager stood in the center of the library, turning slowly, absorbing the room the way someone returns to a house they once lived in and finds it both exactly the same and unbearably different. Then she sat down in the Duchess's reading chair, on top of the shawl, with the proprietary ease of someone who had earned the right. "Sit," she told Sable, "and tell me what you've found." So Sable told her. The scope of the collection, the water damage, the upper gallery correspondence, the cross-referencing with the household inventory, the missing volumes she hadn't yet traced. She spoke precisely, professionally, the way she'd have presented to any employer. The dowager listened without interrupting. When Sable finished, silence settled between them like dust. "You're thorough," the dowager said, "and you care about this work. I can hear it in how you describe her collection. You don't say the books. You say her books. That matters." Sable folded her hands. "She was remarkable, Your Grace. The collection makes that clear. She was the most intelligent person I've ever known, including my own son, who was brilliant in his way, and Deverell, who is brilliant in a different, harder way." The dowager leaned forward. "Now, tell me the part you left out. Tell me about my grandson." Sable hesitated. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't be coy. You've been living in his house for 2 weeks. You've been working in the room he can barely enter. You've been breathing the same air as his grief every day. Tell me how he is." The directness stripped away every possible deflection. Sable considered lying, considered diplomacy, considered the dozen careful answers that would satisfy without revealing. Then she thought of the dowager's face when she'd seen the shawl still waiting on the chair. "He's drowning," Sable said, quietly, competently, with perfect posture. "He manages the estate. He maintains the house. He controls every variable he can reach. But he can't reach the one that matters. He can't bring her back, and he can't let her go, so he's frozen. This library is the center of it. He locked it away because opening it meant admitting she's gone. Now the walls are failing, and the books are rotting, and he's had to let a stranger in. And I think that feels to him like losing her all over again." The dowager said nothing for a long time. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair, her fingers curled into the shawl's fabric, pressing it against the wood as if anchoring herself. "His mother would have liked you," she said finally. She had no patience for people who softened the truth to make it palatable. She called it intellectual cowardice. "I call it a waste of time." The dowager's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, something fiercer. "How old are you?" 23, Your Grace." "Family?" "Deceased parents. An aunt in Hertfordshire who prefers my absence to my company." "Education?" "My father was a schoolmaster before his health declined. He taught me everything he knew. Latin, French, natural philosophy, literature, history. My mother taught me everything else." The dowager studied her with an intensity that felt like standing in direct sunlight. "And what precisely is your arrangement with my grandson?" "I catalog the library. I live in the East Wing. I submit weekly reports. We interact as little as possible, which suits us both. Does it? The question was a trap, elegantly baited. Sable recognized it the way she'd recognize a loose stare, something that looked solid, but would give way the moment you put weight on it. It suits the arrangement, Your Grace. That's not what I asked. Sable held the dowager's gaze. I'm here to do a job, nothing more. The dowager stood, smoothing her skirts. My daughter-in-law said something similar when she first came to this house. She was hired as a music tutor for Deverell's aunt. Lasted 3 months before my son fell hopelessly in love with her. She moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be staying for a fortnight. I want to see your full catalog progress. And Miss Renfield? Your Grace? If you hurt him, if you crack that boy open and then leave because it gets difficult, I will make certain you never work in any house of consequence again. He's already been broken once. I won't watch it happen twice. She left the library, and Sable stood alone in the silence, her pulse hammering, the dowager's warning ringing in her ears like a bell struck too hard. If you crack that boy open and then leave, as if Sable had that power. Sable had, as if a cataloger from nowhere, with dust on her sleeves and a pencil behind her ear, could crack open a duke. But even as she dismissed it, something trembled at the edge of her awareness. A feeling she didn't yet have a name for, delicate and dangerous, as the letters she'd spent the morning saving from the damp. She went back to work, and if her hand shook slightly as she handled the late Duchess's correspondence, she chose not to examine why. The dowager's fortnight changed the temperature of the house, not immediately, not obviously. But Margot Marchand had the effect of a lit match near dry kindling. The heat reached everywhere, disturbing surfaces that had been undisturbed for years. She insisted on family dinners, all 4 of them, seated in the formal dining room that hadn't been used since the old Duke's death. Sable tried to refuse. She was staff, not family, and dining with a duke was so far beyond the boundaries of her position that it bordered on absurdity. Nonsense, the dowager said. You live in my daughter-in-law's rooms. You handle her correspondence daily, and you're the only person in this house who can discuss anything more stimulating than crop rotation. You'll dine with us. So Sable dined with them, and discovered, to her surprise, that the dowager was performing her own kind of surgery. She asked Sable questions about the collection in front of Deverell. Specific questions that required detailed answers. Answers that revealed the depth and brilliance of his mother's intellectual life. She did it casually, between courses, as if the conversation were merely pleasant, rather than precisely targeted. Miss Renfield, you mentioned the Duchess corresponded with Professor Harwick in Vienna. What was the subject? Botanical classification, Your Grace. She disagreed with his taxonomy of alpine flora. Quite vigorously, actually. There's a letter where she calls his methodology. Sable caught herself, glancing at Deverell. She was direct in her criticism. She called him a taxonomical Philistine, the dowager supplied, with relish. I was there when she wrote it. Deverell, you were perhaps 6. You sat on her lap and drew pictures of horses while she dismantled a professor's life work in 3 pages. Deverell's fork paused midway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. I don't remember that. You wouldn't. You were drawing. But she was magnificent. The dowager turned to Sable. Did she keep his reply? She did. He conceded 2 of her 3 objections and invited her to present to the society. She declined. The letter explaining why is... Sable stopped. She'd been about to say, heartbreaking. It's in the upper gallery. Why did she decline? Theron asked, leaning forward. Sable looked at Deverell. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like standing too close to a fire. Because the society didn't admit women, Sable said quietly. She would have had to present through a male proxy. Someone else would read her words, receive credit for her arguments. She refused to let her work exist under someone else's name. Silence settled over the table. Deverell picked up his wineglass, drank, set it down. His hand was steady, but a muscle in his jaw ticked once, twice. "I didn't know that," he said. 4 words. But Sable heard what lived beneath them. "I didn't know my own mother. I locked her library before I could learn who she really was." The dinners continued. Each evening, the Dowager drew another thread from the collection, another story, another facet of the woman who'd built it. And each evening, Sable watched something shift behind Deverell's careful facade. Not crumbling, he was too controlled for that, but softening, the way ice softens before it breaks. On the 9th night, Sable arrived at the dining room to find only Deverell. "Grandmother has a headache," he said. "Theron is in the village. It appears we're dining alone. I can eat in my rooms. Sit down, Miss Renfield." She sat. The dining room felt enormous with only 2 of them, candlelight stretching their shadows across the walls. For several minutes, they ate in the silence that had become their default, comfortable, and charged in equal measure. "The letter," Deverell said abruptly. "The one where she refused the society. May I read it?" "Of course. It's your library." "It's her library. I just inherited the building." He set down his knife. "You've been here 3 weeks. You know her better than I do. That's—" He searched for the word. "Unconscionable. You were grieving. I was hiding. There's a difference." The honesty of it stunned her. She looked at him across the candlelit table, this man carved from granite and duty, and saw for the first time the fracture lines running through him. Not weaknesses, the places where the person existed beneath the title. "It's not too late," she said. "The letters are all there. Her marginalia, her correspondence, her arguments. She left a map of who she was, your Grace. You just haven't read it yet." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Grief and gratitude, and something else she couldn't name, something that made her look away first. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "Show me the upper gallery tomorrow." "Yes, your Grace." "Deverell." She looked up. He wasn't smiling, but the ice behind his eyes had thinned. "If you're going to introduce me to my own mother, you might as well use my name." The Dowager announced the midsummer gathering 3 days before it happened, which was either poor planning or a deliberate tactical strike. Knowing Margot Marchand, Sable suspected the latter. "Just the neighbors," the Dowager said breezily over breakfast. "Sir Gideon and Lady Oriel Ashford, the Harlows, the Winthrops, the vicar and his wife. 30 people at most. A garden party. Nothing elaborate." Deverell's expression suggested he considered 30 people an invading army. "It's been 2 years since this house entertained," the Dowager continued. "People are beginning to talk. The reclusive Duke, locked away with his dead mother's books. It's not healthy, and it's not wise. I don't care what people say. You should. You hold a title. Titles exist in public, whether you like it or not." She turned to Sable. "You'll attend, of course." Sable nearly choked on her tea. "Your Grace, I really don't think—" "You've been living in this house for a month. If you don't appear, people will assume something scandalous. If you do appear, properly introduced as the library cataloger and my personal guest, the narrative is controlled." The Dowager smiled. "I don't leave narratives to chance." Theron caught Sable's eye from across the table and mouthed, "Just say yes." She did, because arguing with Margot Marchand was like arguing with weather. Calloway produced a dress from somewhere, a gown of pale gray-blue silk that had belonged to the Dowager in her younger years, altered overnight by a maid with nimble fingers. It fit surprisingly well, though Sable felt like a fraud wearing it. Beautiful fabric over the same girl from Hertfordshire who'd arrived in the rain with dust in her hair. The garden party was everything Sable had imagined and feared. Lanterns strung through the trees, tables laden with summer food, Music from a quartet hired from the village. And people. So many people. All of them watching. All of them curious about the Duke who'd emerged from his hermitage, and the unknown woman standing at the edge of his world. Miss Renfield. A woman in cream silk approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Lady Oriel Ashford. Margot tells me you're cataloging the library. How fascinating. What an unusual occupation for a young woman." "Not so unusual," Sable replied. "Women have been preserving knowledge for centuries. We just aren't always credited for it." Lady Oriel's smile tightened. "Quite. And you're staying in the house itself. How very modern." The implication was delicate, but unmistakable. Sable felt it land the way you feel a pin pressed against skin. Not yet painful, but promising pain. "The East Wing," Sable said evenly. "Separate from the family quarters. Mrs. Calloway can confirm the arrangements are entirely proper." "Oh, I'm sure they are. It's just that tongues do wag in the country. A young woman, an unmarried duke, all those long hours alone in a library. You can see how it might appear. I can see how people with insufficient occupation might choose to imagine things that don't exist." Lady Oriel's nostrils flared. Behind Sable, she heard Theron stifle something that might have been a laugh. The rest of the evening was a gauntlet. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of assessment. The wives measured her dress, her speech, her manners. The husbands measured her proximity to the Duke. The Dowager circulated like a general, managing introductions, steering conversations away from anything too pointed, maintaining the fiction that Sable was a perfectly ordinary guest at a perfectly ordinary gathering. Then Sir Gideon Ashford approached Deverell within earshot of half the party. "Marchand, I must say, your cataloguer is rather more decorative than one might expect. If I'd known library work came in such pleasant form, I'd have hired one myself." The laughter from the nearby group was appreciative, masculine, ugly. Sable saw Deverell's expression change, not the controlled neutrality she'd grown accustomed to. Something darker, colder, the expression of a man who'd just identified an enemy. "Miss Renfield's qualifications are in Latin, French, natural philosophy, and manuscript preservation," Deverell said, his voice carrying with deliberate precision. "She's identified and preserved correspondence that 3 previous catalogers failed to find. She's the most competent person to enter my employ in a decade, and I'd be grateful, Ashford, if you could manage to address her professional abilities rather than her appearance. Or is that beyond your capacity?" The silence that followed was absolute. Sir Gideon's face reddened. The laughter died as if strangled. Every person within 20 feet stood frozen, glasses halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-syllable. Sable couldn't breathe, not because of Sir Gideon's comment, she'd survived worse, but because of what Deverell had just done. He'd defended her, publicly, fiercely, in front of his neighbors, his peers, the people whose opinion he was supposed to court. He'd chosen her dignity over social comfort, and he'd done it without hesitation. Their eyes met across the garden, and the look he gave her was not the look of an employer defending his staff. It was the look of a man who'd drawn a line in the ground and dared the world to cross it. The moment broke when the Dowager materialized with 2 glasses of wine and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Gideon, darling, come tell me about your new mare. I hear she threw you twice last week. How delightful." She steered Sir Gideon away with the ruthless efficiency of a sheepdog, and the party resumed its surface pleasantries. But something had changed. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew. Later, when the lanterns burned low and the last guests departed, Sable found Deverell standing at the edge of the garden, looking out at the dark parkland. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Done what?" "Defended me like that, in front of everyone. People will talk." People were already talking. At least now they'll talk about the right thing. He turned to face her. In the lantern light, His features were softer, the sharp edges blurred into something almost gentle. He had no right to speak about you that way. Men like him always speak that way. It's not new. It should be intolerable. The anger in his voice wasn't for show. It was real, raw, personal. You came to this house to do valuable work. You've done it brilliantly. You deserve to be seen for that, not reduced to... He stopped, his jaw tight. Decoration? She offered. His eyes met hers, and what she saw there made her stomach drop. You are many things, Miss Renfield. Decoration is not one of them. He walked away before she could respond, and Sable stood alone in the garden, her heart pounding, the taste of something impossible on her tongue. Lady Oriel returned 3 days later, without her husband, carrying a gift basket and a smile that concealed intentions the way silk conceals a blade. She found Sable in the library, working on the upper gallery correspondence. The Dowager had departed that morning, a sudden summons from her sister in Bath, leaving Sable without the older woman's protective presence for the first time since the garden party. Miss Renfield, I do hope I'm not interrupting. Lady Oriel, this is unexpected. I brought preserves from Mrs. Calloway and thought I'd pop in. She set the basket down and began circling the library with the casual thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection. What a remarkable room. I visited often when the late Duchess was alive. She used to host the most wonderful reading afternoons. That sounds like her, Sable said carefully. You speak as though you knew her. I know her through her books. Lady Oriel paused at the reading chair, her fingers brushing the shawl. You know, people in the village are talking about you. The mysterious woman in the Duke's house, living in his mother's rooms no less, handling his mother's private letters. I'm handling the library collection. It's my job. Is it? Lady Oriel turned, and the pretense of friendliness evaporated like morning frost. Because from where I stand, it looks rather different. A young woman with no family, no fortune, no reputation to protect, installed in a grieving man's house, slowly making herself indispensable. It's a very old strategy, Miss Renfield. You're not the first to try it. The words hit like stones, each one precisely aimed. I'm not trying any strategy. Then you're doing it by accident, which is almost worse, because he's starting to believe it. I saw his face at the garden party. I saw how he looked at you, and I saw how you looked at him. I don't know what you think you saw. I saw a man who hasn't felt anything in years suddenly feeling something, and a woman who's in the perfect position to exploit that. Lady Oriel stepped closer. His mother was a brilliant woman, but she was also an outsider. She came from nothing, married above her station, and spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged. It destroyed her health, the constant performance, the endless scrutiny. She died exhausted, Miss Renfield, literally exhausted from the effort of being someone she was never meant to be. The cruelty of it was clinical, not because it was untrue. Sable didn't know enough to judge, but because it painted a future she'd already feared. A lifetime of proving herself, of being measured and found wanting, of watching a man she cared about defend her while the world sharpened its knives. You think I'm like her, Sable said. Her voice came out steady, but her hands trembled beneath the reading table. I think you're worse. She at least had talent. What do you have? A knowledge of old books and a gift for making a lonely man feel understood? That's not a foundation for a life. That's a parlor trick. Sable stood. I think you should leave. I think you should leave, Lady Oriel countered. Before this goes any further. Before he does something irreversible because you've made him believe a cataloger from nowhere could be enough. She departed with the same practiced grace she'd arrived with, leaving the gift basket on the table like a calling card from a war she fully intended to win. Sable sank into the reading chair. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The Duchess's shawl was soft against her back, jasmine-scented, and she pressed her face into her palms and tried to breathe. Lady Oriel was wrong. She had to be wrong. But the worst lies are the ones threaded with truth, and the truth was this. Sable didn't belong here. She was a cataloger, a woman whose entire worldly possessions fit in a single trunk, a woman who'd been sent to the East Wing to learn her place, and who had instead, without meaning to, without planning it, begun to love a man she had absolutely no right to love. She was still sitting there when Deverell found her. He entered the library through the gallery staircase, the private route, the one he'd started using to visit his mother's letters when he thought no one was watching. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? Nothing. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're sitting in the dark. He crossed to her, and for the first time, knelt beside the chair, so they were at eye level. Tell me. Lady Oriel was here. His expression hardened. What did she say? The truth. Sable's voice splintered. That I don't belong here. That I'm making you believe something that can't work. That your mother tried to be someone she wasn't, and it killed her. And I'm... She stopped, pressing her lips together. You're what? I'm doing the same thing. Pretending I fit. Pretending these last weeks have been real, and not just proximity and loneliness and... Sable. Her name. Not Miss Renfield. Her name, said in a voice stripped of every defense he'd ever built. My mother didn't die because she didn't belong, he said. She died because the world refused to make room for her, and she exhausted herself trying to earn space she shouldn't have needed to earn. His hand found hers, his fingers closing around her trembling ones. Lady Oriel was my grandmother's companion before she married Ashford. She wanted my father for herself. She's never forgiven my mother for existing. That doesn't change the facts. You're still the woman who walked into my study and told me to stop punishing her. You're still the person who understood my mother's work better in 3 weeks than anyone in this family managed in 20 years. You're still the only person in my life who has ever told me the truth without flinching. His grip tightened. If that's a parlor trick, then I'm grateful for it, because it woke me up. She looked at him, kneeling on the floor of his mother's library, holding her hand, his carefully maintained walls in ruins around him, and felt the last of her own defenses give way. I'm scared, she whispered. I know. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it undid her completely. So am I, but I'm more scared of the alternative. What's the alternative? You leave. I go back to being numb. These books go back to being monuments instead of memories. And I spend the rest of my life reading my mother's letters and knowing she'd be ashamed of me for letting fear win. A tear slid down Sable's cheek. He caught it with his thumb, his touch so careful it barely registered as contact. Stay, he said. Not in the East Wing, not as a cataloger. Stay because you want to. Stay because this is real. She couldn't speak, so she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, breathing him in, cedar and ink and the faintest trace of the garden. And the word came out like a breath released after years of holding. Yes. She left on a Thursday, not because she'd stopped meaning yes, not because the word had faded or thinned or revealed itself as something less than she'd felt when she said it. She left because of what came after. The morning following the library, a letter arrived from Sable's aunt. She recognized the handwriting, sharp, economical, devoid of affection, and opened it at the breakfast table, while Deverell reviewed estate correspondence, and Theron buttered toast with the oblivious contentment of someone unaware that the world was about to shift. Sable, I've received word from Lady Ashford regarding your situation at Ashworth Hall. It seems you've managed to create precisely the kind of scandal I sent you away to avoid. An unmarried woman living in a duke's house, attending social events as his guest, being defended publicly by him as though you were something more than hired help. Your mother would be mortified. I've written to the Duke's solicitor requesting your immediate release from employment. I've also written to the registry in London to ensure your name is removed from the cataloger's list. No reputable household will hire a woman with your kind of notoriety. You have 1 week to return to Hertfordshire. I'll arrange a position with the Garrick family as a maid-of-all-work. It's beneath your education, but within your circumstances. Further disruption will result in the severance of all familial obligation. Aunt Phoebe. The letter was vintage Aunt Phoebe, punitive, precise, and devastatingly effective. Not because of the threat to cut ties. That bond had been fraying since Sable was 9. But because of the letter to the Duke's solicitor, because of the registry, because Aunt Phoebe hadn't merely recalled her niece, she'd salted the earth behind her. Sable set the letter down. Deverell glanced up from his papers. Anything important? No, just my aunt. She folded the letter into her pocket and finished breakfast, with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. She spent the day in the library, working with mechanical precision, cataloging volumes she could no longer see clearly through the blur in her eyes. The upper gallery letters were nearly all transferred. The inventory cross-reference was 2/3 complete. The damaged volumes on the east wall had been stabilized, treated, wrapped in acid-free tissue. The work was almost done. The work was the only legitimate reason she had to be here. Without it, she was what Lady Oriel said, what Aunt Phoebe said. A woman with no position, no family support, no professional standing, clinging to a man's household because she had nowhere else to go. And Deverell, brilliant, grieving, newly vulnerable Deverell, would defend her, would fight for her, would burn his reputation and his social standing to shield her from the consequences of a connection the world had already decided was inappropriate. She wouldn't let him. The decision calcified between lunch and afternoon tea, hardening into something she could almost mistake for resolve. She packed her trunk that evening. The same trunk, the same 3 dresses, the montagne. She left the gray-blue silk gown folded on the bed. She left her cataloging notes, meticulous and complete, on the library reading table. The letter to Deverell took 9 drafts. Each one said too much or too little. She settled on the one that said almost nothing, because almost nothing was all she could manage without shattering. Deverell, the catalog is nearly complete. My notes will allow any competent successor to finish the remaining work. I've included preservation recommendations for the upper gallery correspondence. Thank you for allowing me to know your mother through her books. She deserved better than a locked room and 8 years of silence. So do you. Please don't look for me. This is the right decision, even if it doesn't feel like one. Sable. She left before dawn, walking the 3 miles to the village in the dark, catching the first mail coach south. She didn't look back at Ashworth Hall. She couldn't. Hertfordshire was exactly as she'd left it. Aunt Phoebe's house, narrow and cold, smelling of carbolic soap and disapproval. Her old room, reclaimed from the Michaelmas tenants, stripped to bare walls and a thin mattress. The Garrick position begins Monday, Aunt Phoebe said, as if Sable had merely been running an errand rather than living another life entirely. 6 in the morning until 8 in the evening, half-day Sundays. Sable nodded, unpacked her trunk, set the montagne on the windowsill. For 3 days, she moved through the motions of her old life, scrubbed floors, mended stockings, walked to the village for bread, tried not to think about the library, the jasmine scent, the way Deverell had said her name like it was something he'd been searching for. On the 3rd night, she opened the montagne and found something she hadn't put there. A letter, tucked between the pages, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Older, more elegant, faintly shaking. It was addressed to no one. But it had been placed exactly where Sable would find it, between the pages her father had underlined most heavily. Someone had known she would look here. Someone had understood. She unfolded it and began to read, and everything changed. The letter was from the Duchess, not to Sable. The woman had died 8 years before Sable ever set foot in Ashworth Hall. It was a letter the Duchess had written and never sent, tucked into a book that had sat on a shelf in the upper gallery until Sable placed it in her own trunk without checking between every page. An accident. A coincidence. Or something else entirely. To whoever finds this, if you're reading my letters, then the library has finally been opened. I'm glad. Books are not meant to be tombs, and neither are the people who love them. I came to this house with nothing but a talent for music and an inconvenient habit of speaking my mind. I was hired as a tutor. I fell in love with a man who existed behind a title so heavy it had crushed every genuine impulse out of him. His mother, my dear, terrifying Margot, told me I was foolish. She was right. Love is foolish. It is also the only thing I've done in my life that mattered. Ashworth will try to diminish you, not the house. The house is merely stone. I mean the idea of it. The weight of name and expectation and the terrible gravity of being needed by something larger than yourself. It will tell you to be smaller, to fit, to smooth your edges until you're acceptable. Don't. The world is full of acceptable women. It needs more unacceptable ones. Be stubborn, be brilliant, be more than they expect. And if someone in this house is brave enough to love you for it, let them. Not because they'll save you. You don't need saving. But because the right kind of love makes you more of what you already are, not less. With hope for whoever you turn out to be, Isadora Marchand Sable read it twice, 3 times. Then she pressed the letter to her chest and wept, not the controlled, quiet tears she'd perfected over years of loss, but the wrenching, graceless kind that leave you hollowed out and somehow lighter. Isadora Marchand, dead 8 years, had reached across time and placed a hand on her shoulder, had seen her, had known her, had said the things Sable needed to hear from someone who had walked this exact path and chosen to walk it anyway. If someone in this house is brave enough to love you for it, let them. The knock on the door came at 7 the next morning. Sable opened it, expecting Aunt Phoebe with another lecture about the Garrick position. Instead, she found Theron Marchand, travel-worn, horse-lathered, and standing on the doorstep of a house he clearly considered beneath contempt. "Before you say no," he said, breathing hard. "Hear me out." "How did you find me?" "Mrs. Calloway knew your aunt's address. I've been writing since yesterday." He leaned against the doorframe, catching his breath. "He's destroyed, Sable. I've seen him grieve our mother. I've seen him bury our father's memory under mountains of ledger books. But I've never seen him like this. He won't eat. He won't leave the library. He sits in her chair and reads your cataloging notes like they're scripture. Theron, he didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here. He told me to respect your decision because that's what Deverell does. He respects decisions even when they're wrong. But I'm not Deverell, and I don't think your decision is respectable. I think it's terrified." Aunt Phoebe appeared behind Sable, her face rigid. "Who is this person?" "Theron Marchand, brother of the Duke of Ashworth." He gave a bow so perfunctory it bordered on insulting. "I'm here for your niece. Temporarily, I hope. She has a position arranged. The Garrick family can find another maid." Theron turned back to Sable. "He's already dismissed the solicitor who tried to enforce your aunt's letter. Your name is still on the registry. Lady Oriel has been informed, by our grandmother, in a letter I very much wish I'd been present to watch delivered, that her involvement in your departure constitutes interference in family affairs and will be treated accordingly." "That doesn't change what I am," Sable said quietly. "What society will say." "Society said my mother was unsuitable too. She built the most important private library in the county and corresponded with half the scholars in Europe. Society can be wrong. And if it destroys him? If defending me costs him, You've already cost him. You left, and he fell apart. The damage is done, Sable. The only question is whether it heals into something whole or scars over into something worse. She looked at Theron, this bright, warm, fiercely loyal man who'd ridden through the night for a brother who hadn't asked, and felt the last wall inside her give way. I found a letter, she said. Your mother's. In the Montagne. Theron's expression shifted. What did it say? It said, don't be smaller. Her voice broke. It said, let them love you. Theron held out his hand. Then come home. Sable looked at his hand, looked at her aunt's house behind her, narrow and cold and safe, looked at the Montagne on the windowsill, her father's handwriting, her mother's hairbrush, the small, bounded world she'd been expected to inhabit forever. She took Theron's hand. I need 10 minutes to pack. You need 5. I'll get the horse. Ashworth Hall looked different in the late afternoon light. Golden. Warm. Alive in a way it hadn't been when she'd first arrived in the rain, deposited at the servants' entrance like a parcel no one had ordered. Theron had brought her to the main door. Front entrance, he said, swinging down from the horse and offering his hand. You're not staff. You never were. Mrs. Calloway opened the door before they reached it. Her expression was carefully composed, but her eyes were bright. Miss Renfield, welcome back. Where is he? Sable asked. The library, miss. He's been there since you left. Sable climbed the stairs alone. Theron didn't follow. Mrs. Calloway didn't follow. This was hers to do. The library doors were open. Afternoon light poured through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow. The globe stood in its corner. The shawl lay across the reading chair. The shelves stretched upward. Thousands of volumes. A dead woman's brilliant mind, preserved in leather and paper and ink. Deverell sat at the reading table. Her cataloging notes were spread before him, covered in his own annotations. Corrections, additions, questions written in the margins the way his mother had written in hers. He'd been continuing her work, carrying it forward in the only way he knew how. He looked up when her shadow fell across the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark-eyed, his shirt wrinkled in a way that would have horrified him a month ago. But his eyes were the most awake she'd ever seen them. You came back, he said. I found your mother's letter. He frowned. What letter? Sable reached into her pocket and placed Isadora's letter on the table, beside the cataloging notes, beside his annotations, beside the accumulated evidence of 2 people trying to save the same thing without knowing the other was there. Deverell picked it up, read it slowly. His hands began to shake before he reached the second paragraph, and by the end, his composure, the granite facade, the architectural control, the 8 years of carefully maintained walls, dissolved like frost in sunlight. He pressed the letter to his forehead, and his shoulders heaved once, twice, then stilled. When he looked up, his eyes were wet and clear, and he was smiling. Not the controlled approximation of a smile he offered at social functions. An actual smile, unguarded and devastating. She knew, he said. She wrote this, knowing that someday, someone would need it. She wrote it for whoever opened the library. Sable moved closer. But I think she wrote it for you, too. For whoever you'd become when you finally let someone in. He stood, the chair scraping back, and crossed to her in 3 steps. His hands cupped her face the way you hold something irreplaceable, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers, the adrenaline of a man about to leap off a cliff. I need to say this properly, he said. Not in the dark, not in the middle of a crisis. Properly. Then say it. I love you. Not because you saved the collection, though you did. Not because you understood my mother, though you do. I love you because you told me I was rude within 30 seconds of meeting me, and you were right. Because you refuse to be diminished by a title or a wing or a locked door. Because you are the most unacceptable, stubborn, magnificent person I have ever known, and my mother would have adored you." Sable laughed through tears. "You're quoting her letter." "I'm quoting reality. She just said it first." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I don't want you in the East Wing. I don't want you as a cataloger. I want you here, permanently, unreasonably, in every room of this house and every part of my life. People will talk. Let them. Your grandmother will have opinions. My grandmother has already written Lady Oriel a letter that reportedly made her cry. I think she's made her position clear. Deverell. Sable." She kissed him. Not gently, not carefully, not with the measured restraint of two people navigating propriety. She kissed him the way his mother had written her letters, boldly, completely, without apology. His arms closed around her and lifted her slightly off the floor, and she felt the moment his control finally broke, not into chaos, but into something better. Openness. Trust. The terrifying, exhilarating release of a man who had decided to stop holding on and start holding someone instead. When they parted, breathless, his forehead rested against hers. "The catalog," he murmured. "Is it really almost done?" 2 more weeks, maybe 3. "Then I have 2 to 3 weeks to convince you to stay forever. I should start immediately." "You could start by showing me the rest of the house. I've only ever seen the East Wing, the library, and the dining room." He took her hand, properly, interlacing their fingers, not the formal offering of an arm, but the grip of someone who had no intention of letting go, and led her through Ashworth Hall. He showed her the morning room where his mother had managed the estate finances in secret, the music room where she'd taught his aunt piano and fallen in love with his father over Beethoven sonatas, the gallery where his father's portrait hung beside his mother's, and where Deverell stopped and stood in silence for a full minute, holding Sable's hand, looking at the woman who'd written the letter that brought everything full circle. "I'll have her portrait moved to the library," he said quietly. "She belongs there." 3 weeks later, the catalog was complete. 4,217 volumes, 643 letters, a comprehensive preservation plan, and a recommendation, formally submitted and formally accepted, to donate a selection of the Duchess's correspondence to the Somerville Archive at Oxford, where women scholars could study the work of a woman who'd been denied the right to present her own research. The Dowager returned for the occasion. She surveyed the finished catalog, the restored shelves, the upper gallery now properly ventilated and cedar-lined, and gave a single nod. "Competent work," she said, which from Margot Marchand was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Then she turned to Sable. "I understand my grandson has asked you to remain." "He has, Your Grace." "And you've accepted." "I have." The Dowager studied her for a long moment. "My daughter-in-law once told me that the women who change this family are the ones who refuse to be changed by it. I didn't understand her then. I believe I'm beginning to." She kissed Sable's cheek, brief, dry, startling, and swept from the room to terrorize Mrs. Calloway about the evening's dinner arrangements. Theron, who'd been lurking in the doorway, grinned. That's the closest she's come to saying "I approve" in the entire history of human speech. Deverell proposed on a Sunday, in the library, with no audience, no spectacle, no public declaration, just the two of them, and 4,000 books, and the faint scent of jasmine that Sable had finally identified. Not a ghost, but a jasmine vine growing outside the East Wing window, planted by the Duchess 30 years ago, and still, against all odds, blooming. "I don't have a ring yet," he said. "I wanted to ask before I had one, so you'd know this isn't about ceremony. It's about you. Ask then. Stay. Not for a season. Not for a position. Stay because this is your home, because these are your books now, because I am better, braver, and more awake with you than I have ever been without you. Marry me, Sable. Be unacceptable with me for the rest of our lives. She said yes the way she did everything, without hesitation, without apology, with the fierce, stubborn certainty that had carried her from a rain-soaked carriage through a locked wing and into the center of a life she'd never dared imagine. The wedding was small. The dowager insisted on a proper ceremony at the village church, and then complained about every detail of it, with the satisfied energy of someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted. Theron served as best man and wept openly, which he denied afterward with complete conviction. Mrs. Calloway wore a new dress for the first time in 11 years. Alice scattered wildflowers down the aisle, and on their first evening as husband and wife, Deverell led Sable not to the master suite, not to the grand rooms of the West Wing, but to the East Wing. Her wing. Their wing now. You sent me here to learn my place, Sable said, standing in the doorway of the rooms where she'd spent her first lonely night. I did. And did I learn it? He pulled her close, his arms around her, his chin resting on her hair. You learned it before I did. Your place was never where I put you. It was wherever you decided to stand. Outside the window, the jasmine vine curled against the glass, blooming wide in the last light. Inside, the East Wing was warm for the first time in 8 years. Not because of the fire in the hearth, though that helped. Because someone was finally, permanently, irrevocably home. Thank you for being here. You're the reason these stories live and breathe, because you believe in love that refuses to be smaller than the world demands. In people who fight not with swords, but with honesty and courage, and the stubborn refusal to accept less than they deserve. Your presence here means everything. Every listen, every moment you spend with these characters. It matters. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you even a little, consider subscribing. More stories are coming. Or stories about people who choose bravery over safety, who love without permission, who find home in the most unexpected places. Thank you for making this space what it is. I'll see you in the next one.